So there are a number of different file operations that we need to understand and understand how they work. And then once we have those basic understanding of the building blocks, then we can start putting it together into using it for our programs. So the first thing we need to do, maybe this seems obvious, is we need to understand how to open a file. And opening a file in Python is pretty simple. There's an open function that creates and returns a file object. Okay. Now, opening a file is what we have to do before we do anything with a file, before we write to it, before we read from it, all that stuff. So what we do is we call the open function, and we give it a file name as the first argument. And then the second argument is a single letter that represents what we want to do with that file. And that letter is important because it impacts what you do with the file, but also how Python interacts with that file. If we want to read from a file, we give it an R, lowercase, and that opens the file for reading. That means that is all you can do with it. But when we open a file for reading, it also creates something called a pointer, which keeps track of how much of that file you have read. And that's important because you can read that whole file at once into a variable. You can read it one character at a time. You can read it one line at a time, or anything in between. So that pointer becomes important, and that's what read gives us. It gives us the ability to track where we're at in that file, reading it wise. Append, write, and create all do very similar things with some very subtle differences. And it's important to understand the difference because if you don't use the right one, you could destroy data that you don't want to destroy, or you could get all kinds of errors in your program. So append, when you see append, you want to think about like a diary or a journal or something where you're just adding to that file. Every time you open a file to append, it will open that file and keep what's there, but whatever you add to that file will go on to the end of that. Okay, so just like I said, it's like a diary. Every time you open up your diary, you write a little bit more and then you add to it. If the file does not exist, then append will create that file. Okay. If I try and open a file for reading and the file doesn't exist, I get an error. Okay, but if I open it with append, it will just create it if it's not there. If I open a file for writing, then what it does is it erases everything that's there and replaces it with whatever I write to it. So pretty big difference between the two there. If the file doesn't exist, it will be created. Okay. Create is still different. If the file exists and you call create, you'll actually get an error because create says only open this file if it doesn't already exist. So create is sort of a safeguard that says I don't want to overwrite something that's already there. I need to create something new. So create will create that file if it doesn't exist, and it will write to it. If it does exist, it throws an error. So those are the four different flags when you open a file.